or occupy the front seat of a bus had no effect on our material standard of living. But in removing a caste stigma, it revolutionized our psychology and elevated the spiritual content of our being. And then he goes on to say, what's phase 2 about? But dignity is also corroded by poverty. No worker can maintain his morale or sustain his spirit if in the marketplace his capacities are declared to be worthless to society. If society changes its concepts, and think about, well, I'll leave the resonance to you. If society changes its concepts by placing responsibility on its system, not on the individual, and guarantees secure employment or a minimum income, dignity will come within reach of all. And to achieve those goals, guaranteed income, secure employment, King planned that other march on Washington. And you know, famously, Malcolm X ridiculed the first one, said it was a farce on Washington, said the government dictated what to do and where to go, where to march and what sign to hold, when to stay in town and when to get out of town. Told him to get out of town by sundown. So King, in his plan for this second march, I'm not saying it's directly in response to Malcolm X, I'm just saying keep in mind what had gone down the first time. In the second march, the plan was to bring people there from all walks of life, black, Native American, Latino, Asian, and to physically obstruct the government. The plan was mass civil disobedience, not a rally with speeches, but actually sitting in and occupying government buildings and roads to shut down Washington, D.C. until the demands were met, to stay in the city and camp there until the demands were met. He called it the Poor People's Campaign, and it was meant to be an opening shot in phase 2. It ended up being the last shot, at least for King's brand of nonviolent protest. There were several problems right from the start. First of all, who's going to sign up for this Poor People's Campaign? For one thing, King's move to the left now put him in opposition to some of his main erstwhile allies, as Michael mentioned, the Northern liberals. Those are the people he had in many ways always relied on. In the past, he could pick up the phone and be on and be talking to the president, be in touch with the White House like that. Once he came out against the Vietnam War, that political cord was cut. And not only was he cut off from funders, from that connection to that audience in the White House, but they went after him. And went after him viciously. Johnson, at the time, flipped out in the Oval Office, screaming, "What is that goddamn nigger preacher doing to me?" That's right. Time magazine, which in 1957 named King their Man of the Year, after his 1967 speech, ran an article called "Confusing the Cause," called King, quote, "a drawling bumpkin, so ignorant that he had not read a newspaper in years, wandered out of his native haunts and away from his natural calling." So right, you thought Reverend Jeremiah Wright had it. They don't want you to get out of that little box that they put you in. Wait, I'm missing page 6. Uh-oh. Well, we'll figure it out. Whereas in the past, he was marching to force the liberals in government to come to the rescue. Now that he moved the struggle, and the struggle was moving to the northern cities, now he's marching against those same northern liberals. They didn't need any special Jim Crow laws to keep the blacks in a ghetto in Chicago. So when King moves his family there to fight for jobs, to fight for housing, to fight against segregation, he runs up against Daley, Mayor Daley had helped fund his campaigns in the South, and now was the man standing in his way, presiding over a system of segregation, de facto segregation in Chicago. So King lost a lot of friends in high places, but you have to say, he was also getting it from the other end. That is, from below. By the mid-60s, correct me people if you think this is wrong, but it seems to me that you could no longer say he was the leader of the black struggle by that time. The most active layer of people who'd been through the civil rights movement were understandably frustrated with being restrained by nonviolence, and were looking at the ideas of armed self-defense. Especially, I want to say, young black people at the time were increasingly looking to the ideas, the young, fresh generation coming into the movement were looking to the ideas of revolution. For many, this whole set of ideas was summed up by Stokely Carmichael's slogan of black power. In fact, when King went to Chicago, it was the first time a black audience had booed him. So for the Poor People's Campaign, King was unable to rely on the unions, unable to rely on the Democratic Party, unable even to rely on the fresh new forces coming in, the black militants. So who did he turn to be like the shock troops, to be the structural, to bottom line this thing? He turned to his own organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC for short, and the black churches, the black clergy. But there too, he ran into problems right away. There was, to say that there was not a consensus about phase 2 would be a great understatement. Within his own organization, every person on the staff had a different idea about what the next focus should be. But in general, I think you have to say, among the black clergy, there was a certain upper echelon of the black community that immediately, once the segregation, once those kind of rigid caste laws were out of the way, the sky was the limit for them in terms of opportunities to be elected office, to hold this or that position. There was opportunities for upward mobility were the order of the day, and that's what people wanted to focus on, the ballot box, elections, building up black power in that sense. They did not want to focus on reaching down to organize, poor people of all colors on that just was not where the clergy were at, and yet that's who King was looking to organize this thing. Honey, I thought, explains it well, just the kind of dissonance of what King was trying to get this group of people to do. He says they'd spent their lives in the civil rights movement and in the black church. Now King called on them to organize a new multiracial constituency around class issues among Mexican Americans, Indians, and poor whites, as well as African Americans. SCLC did not have the resources and organizing structure to make it happen. Almost alone, King had to convince not only the civil rights community and a broader public, but also his own reluctant staff members that they could organize the poor. King organized Ford Foundation, gave him a whole big bunch of money to organize a conference, and he organized a conference. Something like 150 ministers talked at him about this for like 5 days, and by the end of it, almost nobody had signed up for the thing. He went around, toured around black churches, tried again and again, tried to get people to sign up, and it just wasn't happening. And King himself, I think, understood that this was partially a class thing. He said, we have too many Negroes who have somehow, through some education and a degree of economic security, floated or swam out of the backwaters. But now they've forgotten the stench of the backwaters. SCLC had a hard time switching to poverty. The whole thing just wasn't coming together. King fell into a depression, said there's no masses in this mass movement. Ironically, the very same time that King is struggling, trying to figure out how to put this class-based, if you will, fight for economic security together, ironically, at the very same time, there's a process that's unfolding back in the South that is a poor people's campaign, if you will, of another sort. 1,300 black sanitation workers walked off the job, amazingly, February 1st, 1968, in what was an act of mass nonviolent civil disobedience carried out by the poor in their own interest to try to win secure, gainful, guaranteed employment and income. And so when King, and this kind of, Honey tells it as kind of parallel narratives, it's a very powerful book. And when they come together, it's a completely explosive situation. But first of all, why did they go on strike? Why did 1,300 black sanitation workers in Memphis walk out? It's probably not hard to imagine working conditions of sanitation workers 40 years ago couldn't have been all that great, let alone black sanitation workers, let alone black sanitation workers 40 years ago in the South. You essentially had a reproduction of plantation life. Some of these workers had themselves been a few generations back, or just one from a plantation, had come up north to try to get a job. Maybe it didn't work out. A lot of them bounced back down south into jobs. A lot of the plantation jobs were becoming mechanized, and it pushed them into the cities to try to find jobs like this. So for many, this sanitation job was like a lifeline. People were holding on to this thing. And the supervisors themselves were 1 minute out of plantation life. And so they of course, tried to reproduce the exact same kind of social relationship between employer and employee. You could be fired for talking back. You could be fired for being 1 minute late. You could be fired for disagreeing, that kind of thing. The work itself, of course, is, sanitation work is never pleasant. but if there was nothing for them. If they wanted gloves, they had to bring their own. So the citizens of Memphis were not required to bring, little things that just like kill you on a job like that. For example, the citizens were not required to bring the garbage to the curb. So you could have a tub full of, stinking, rotting something. They weren't required to cover it. It could be, maybe it rained and maybe it's full of stuff and it's overflowing and it's running on your clothes. They had to tub it. And of course, if it's spilled on a white person's lawn, there would be hell to pay. So you had to, so you couldn't roll it. You had to carry the thing, like with two people like this. And so people got, hernias, bad backs. They had to pick up dead animals. They had to pick up tree limbs. They had to cut off tree limbs. Everything as it lay had to be grabbed by them in whatever condition, whatever the weight, whatever the circumstances. Their hours, they had no set hours. They got paid for 8 hours, they had to finish their route, whether that route took 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours. And they had no rights on the job. They had no place to relieve themselves. They had no place for breaks. The trucks were outmoded, old, ancient trucks with maggots falling off the side, and they were supposed to be invisible. They weren't allowed to be seen in public. Oh, God forbid, a sanitation worker should be seen eating a sandwich somewhere, so they couldn't hide in the shade of a tree and had to hide in the shade of the truck with the maggots falling off, the truck that stinks and all of the rest of it. It's just absolutely outrageous. And when I said it was a struggle of the poor, I meant that as well. Workers, if it rained, they could be sent home with little or no pay on those days. And meanwhile, the pay that they did get was so low that many of them, I forget the exact statistic, but it was a great majority of them, were also on public assistance at the same time, while working these very long 40-plus hour weeks. One sanitation worker, James Robinson, remembered, before the union, it was whatever they decided they wanted to pay you. If they wanted to pay you, they did. If they didn't want to pay you, they wouldn't. I wasn't making a damn thing. You can't pay the light bill on no 96 cents an hour. They endured these conditions for a very long time. And you think about conditions that people do all the time, endure for a very long time, and probably a lot of people thought they would endure them forever, or that they would just go on and on. Actually, even the guy who did his most to organize them, a guy by the name of T.O. Jones, was a sanitation worker who, lost his marriage, just lost his job, he lost everything, working for 9 years straight to try to organize a union among these guys with very little experience. He tried to pull around people who'd been in World War II or people who'd been in some of the CIO unions. After 9 years, he was basically trying to work for whatever he could off of the dues of whoever he could collect dues from, manually going around to people, and he had like 40 dues payers out of something like 1,700, out of 1,300 workers. So anyway, another consideration, just the last point, is that the spark for a lot of civil rights action, think about, this is a thing that's happening in '68. And the spark for a lot of what happened in the movement came from young people, understandably, from students, sit-ins, that kind of thing. This, ironically, was an older set of workers. And for a lot of people, they were like, these are the last guys who are ever going to go out on something. These are the guys who have a lot of bills to pay, got family, mouths to feed, mortgage. They have a lot of life stuff that's piled up. And there's plenty of unemployed people waiting to take this job. And so it's a very bad situation for them. And it took a lot of people by surprise. But the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back was the death of two workers, Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, it was raining, they were on their way home from the end of their shift, and there's no room for them up in the cab of the truck, so they try to hide in the back, in the compactor, or on the edge of the compactor inside, to get away from the rain. And, there's different theories about what started the thing off, but it's essentially, there's an old, outmoded truck with faulty wiring, and the compactor began and literally mashed them up. One of them almost got away, but got, pulled back in at the last moment, and they were both crushed, basically like garbage. And from that moment, the whole situation, that was it. The company sent the family a few dollars, and people just lost it. One of AFSCME's organizers said the thing just got away from T.O. Jones. It wasn't his, and after 9 years, it just boom. But Jones did try to organize a meeting. I'm trying to hurry along the narrative here so we can get to some of the back to King. Let me see how I can do this. Anyway, they had a meeting, and they thought, 500 people would show up. 900 people showed up and stayed till 11 to wait to hear what the mayor would say. The mayor said he wasn't going to say anything. I'm not going to give you anything. And they just overwhelmingly chanted for a strike. They didn't produce a leaflet. They didn't make there was no material of organization. But the next day, basically, all but 75 workers just went out on strike. And the AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, thank you. I knew that. That organization, that union, which had formerly was sponsoring the 40-member union of sanitation, they said, the leader of that organization said, I need a strike in Memphis, like I need another hole in the head. And he immediately got on the phone with the local guy from the AFL-CIO office and said, you better go down there and tell those people to go back to work. There's a guy named Bill Ross. And Bill remembers the conversation. He says, Bill, you go out there and tell these people to go back to work. And I'll come down there and, I'll see what I can do. I said, buddy, I'm the only one white man in this building. With 1,300 black souls out there, I'm not about to go out there and tell those people to go back to work. Now, if you want to go and tell them to go back to work, you come down here and do it yourself. Now, like a lot of the best and most important strikes in labor history, they never started from the top. The leadership was against them. They didn't want it. They thought it was risky. It was unprepared. And it comes from below. It could have been worse, though. Actually, they lucked out, I think, the sanitation workers, in that AFSCME had recently been taken over by a reform leadership. People who had a little socialism in their bones and in their experience. They were the young Turks of the labor movement at the time, and they hired a lot of civil rights people as AFSCME organizers. So AFSCME was a place, actually, where civil rights people were coming. James Farmer, James Lawson were coming in and out and had jobs for a while and training as union organizers. So when they got there, they were like blown away by the workers and by their feeling and by their determination, and they end up militantly carrying out the strike. To be fair, they did try to bend over backwards. One of the guys, Jerry Worf, he offers right away, shows up in Memphis and offers the mayor to donate a year's worth of union dues to the mayor's favorite charity. And the mayor says no. Mayor Loeb was the old school paternalistic southern white man. He always said, if the workers had a problem, come to me. Talk to me personally. And in fact, the workers went to a city council meeting, and the mayor shows up, and he repeats the same thing. He says, hey, look, I understand you're upset, but look, if you have a problem, come talk to me. And the room falls out with laughter. And the mayor's face completely fell. One of this guy from AFSCME, Jesse Epps, I thought really summed it up. He says, that was the first time in the history of Loeb's life that he was no longer the master. There was an insurrection among the slaves. These are black men laughing at the mayor. Laughing! And the interesting thing about this is that they tried so hard, actually. Even T.O. Jones, but especially the union leaders, some of the more class-conscious among the workers, really tried, actually, and, I'll just say, they tried to keep the racial issue out of it. They thought, strategically, if we don't make it racial, we just make it about union rights, we'll get more support among white people in Memphis, we'll get more support among, I'm speaking too loudly. I've been accused of that. We'll get more support among the labor movement, and they held fast to that for a long period of time. But in truth, there was no way that they were going to avoid that issue with 1,300 black men making demands of a white power structure in Memphis in 1968. How are you going to avoid the race issue? They tried. There was a tension between the clergy, actually, and people were suspicious of the clergy. Some of the workers were suspicious of the clergy, saw them as opportunists, and there was a tension between them and the union activists. But everything the mayor did actually pushed those two camps closer and closer together. They pulled out all the stops. They had the FBI, they had the Secret Service, they had the Army intelligence, they had everybody surveilling the workers and their leaders. They were constantly monitoring the strike. The state legislature passed laws that would send people to prison, long prison sentences, for in any way giving material support to the strike, speaking in favor of the strike, all this kind of thing. So the union leaders couldn't even do their jobs and had to kind of cede, official at least in the media limelight, leadership to the clergy. But everything pushed the black community and the clergy closer and closer with the strikers. Especially there was one incident where they were severely beaten and gassed and pepper sprayed. There was even a federal official who was there from the federal government to monitor what was going on. And he was maced several times in the face. It was completely outrageous. And it was after that incident that the famous slogan appeared on the placards, "I am a man," which spoke volumes about the real meaning of the struggle. In other words, recognition of a union contract is a recognition of my personhood, that I am a social equal, and that I am able to demand and am worthy of the same kinds of things that white people have fought for and gotten. This was a civil rights struggle, but one that puts a little bit more meat on the bones, because that contract guarantees that you pay me at a certain rate, that I have certain rights on the jobs, there's certain things you can do to me and certain things you can't do to me. And so that was all coming together in the slogan, "I am a man." And King's staff begged him and begged him and begged him not to go. He always wanted to go to these things, and then he'd get bogged down. He'd stay there a million years and get all involved, and they did not want that to happen. Yikes. Okay. Try to speed it up. And here he was arguing, the poor people's campaign, we have to do the poor people. Hold on a second. Memphis, we have to go to Memphis. Which is it, Doc? March 18th, in classic King fashion, running, literally the plane lands, and the plane is still moving, and he jumps out and gets into a car, and, arrives at the meeting right as they're introducing him and has to speak or march, or, his staff called it the war on sleep. In fact, in the last year of his life, it's really, you read this one, the Taylor Branch book at Canaan's Edge. He's writing, in this last year of his life, he's writing 3,000 words a day, just completely going from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. Correspondence, speeches, it's insane. He walks on March 18th, he walks into Memphis for the first time into this struggle, into a meeting that holds 15,000 people. So you're talking about 1,300 strikers, they're not the majority. It's become a social struggle in Memphis. It's become a broader thing based on a working class strike. And King walks in the room, just being briefed on the plane and the car ride, whatever. He has no notes in front of him. And he makes, extemporaneously what has to be one of the most brilliant speeches of his career. It's amazing. And Honey has this commentary about, maybe King wasn't the best organizer. Maybe that poor people's thing wasn't the best, wasn't well conceived. But there's something about when King met up with a struggle in progress. And it's not just that he could articulate the best ideas or give it its best the struggle its best articulation, because he could do that. But he's not just a mouthpiece. He could challenge his audience to look at the struggle on a higher level, to make wider connections, to see it in a broader context. And he had this ability to give people an immense amount of courage just when they felt beaten and maced and gassed and legislated against, and everything seems like it's not going their way. And then in arrives King and is like, you know what? This thing is important, and let me tell you why. He said, he told this story that he was telling a lot at that time, the biblical story of the guy who went to hell. Not because he was rich, King would say, but because he passed a poor man, Lazarus, every day and refused to see his plight. And King warned, you got to imagine it with all this going on. If America does not use her vast resource of wealth to end poverty and make it possible for all of God's children to have the basic necessities of life, she too is going to hell. Put that on a postage stamp. America's going to hell. 43 cents. Martin Luther King. I'll take the America's going to hell hat. He went on to connect the strike to this phase 2, the way that he saw it. He said, with Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, one era of our struggle came to a close and a new era came into being. Now our struggle is for genuine equality, which means economic equality. For we know that it isn't enough to integrate lunch counters. What does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't earn enough money to buy a hamburger and a cup of coffee? And so he's got the room, with him, and they have the tubs that they have to tote, the garbage tubs. They're passing them around, collecting money and banging them and making all this noise. And the energy's going to this kind of level where it doesn't make sense to just say, well, good luck, I hope this works out. Thank you, that's my time. He kind of feels on the spot to say something about what to do because they're at an impasse. They've been boxed in from every side, and it doesn't. And actually, at this point, a number of scabs are starting to show up. And so he feels, you have to imagine, he feels a certain amount of pressure to say something about what to do, about what ought to be a next step, how to escalate the struggle. And here's how Honey describes this moment. He says, King paused for a moment and seemed to be thinking out loud. You know what? He asked the crowd. You may be able to escalate the struggle a bit. And then he dropped the bombshell. I tell you what you ought to do. You're together here enough to do it. You ought to have a general work stoppage in the city of Memphis. That ain't how they teach Martin Luther King. General work stoppage. I don't know about you. The first time I read that really hit me. I mean, you're just not taught to think that Martin Luther King was the kind of guy who proposed, peace and love and general work stoppages. But he did. And he actually tried to organize it in Memphis. I mean, that's the thing. He had to do some flying back and forth, and he had to try to keep the Poor People's campaign going, but he was now committed to carrying that out in Memphis, and he tried to do it. But here again, he was actually unsuccessful. When the day came for the stoppage, there was a freakish event, which was a snowstorm that kept, it was like an act of God that kept everybody, it was like a general work stoppage anyway, caused by precipitation. Actually, there was one guy that marched. He was a white guy from a UAW worker from Detroit who was like, wouldn't be daunted. What do I want? When do I want it? So then they rescheduled. They tried it again. But when they tried it again, the thing turned into a riot, and King had to escape with his life. Then undaunted, he decided, okay, we'll try again. I mean, part of the problem was the black radicals, the young people, just weren't down with the nonviolence thing, and it was easy for provocateurs or what have you to get them into a thing with the police. You can imagine it. I don't have time to tell the whole story. They decide to try again. King meets with the youth. He tries to draw them in and tries to learn from that mistake. And then on April 3rd, James Lawson goes to give a speech for an audience, and it's like this thunderstorm, raining outside, and horrible weather. But despite the horrible weather, a few thousand people show up to a meeting, and as soon as he walks in the door by himself, everybody's face falls. And it's like in the middle of the night already, and he realizes, oh, shit, everybody really wants to hear King. So he gets on the phone and calls the Lorraine Motel and says, look, man, they don't want to hear me, they want to hear you. And even though King, again, wore on sleep, he's completely exhausted, he's completely worn out, he agrees and gets in a car and arrives, like an hour or so later. I think it's at the Labor Temple in Memphis. I forget the exact, don't quote me on that, I forget the location. But they had a lot of big things at the Labor Temple in Memphis. So on April 3rd, he gives a speech that he was, once again, not supposed to give. Once again, giving it without notes of any kind, in the middle of the night, completely exhausted. It was a speech. It's supposed to just be Lawson, and it's completely impromptu. And it's, if you haven't heard it, we intended to kind of play it for you as you were coming in here today. But you can look it up. It's all over the internet. And try not to break out in tears here as I recount this speech. But he basically talks about a lot of different things. He starts his speech off by talking about taking a kind of hypothetical trip through time, where the powers that be are kind of saying, if you can live at any time, I'll give you a choice. When do you want to live? And he's going through the ancient Greeks, and he sees the philosophers debating, and he goes through all the different eras. I'm not going to go through all the different eras in history, and basically says, you know what, I choose to live right now. I want to be here right now. And again, something about, you got to imagine what these people have been through, and to hear King say that, you know what, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. I want to be right here where I am in Memphis right now. And he talks about how he gets all these letters. He's always getting letters. And he got a letter from a little white girl who talked about when he was stabbed in Harlem, and that the knife was so close to his heart, and if he had sneezed, he would have died. And she said, Mr. King, I'm glad you did not sneeze. And he says, I get a lot of letters. I get letters from the president. Can't remember them. I get letters from the vice president. Can't remember. Everybody knows what that means in terms of what's going on with King right now. And he says, but I remember that letter. And I'm glad I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I would have missed the sit-ins at the lunch counters. I would have missed the campaign in Birmingham. I would have missed the march in Selma. He goes down all the things that are building up to this moment in the civil rights struggle, and would have missed being here for the victory in Memphis. Like anybody, he said, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And he was assassinated the very next day. All right. They for all their surveillance and taping all of his conversations and all that, they somehow, a racist who was a fugitive from justice, from prison, escaped from prison, managed to get in town, rent a hotel room, buy a rifle, shoot King, get out of town. So surveillance didn't help King at all. As much as they knew about all kinds of threats, and they never told him, and all kinds of stuff. Within hours of King's death, riots broke out. They quickly spread across the country. You have to imagine, these were huge events, not just one or two. I'm not going to go all through the riots because I don't have time. But it's not just one or two cities, 125 cities. Try to imagine that, erupted in smoke. As Honey put it, African Americans everywhere recognized King's death as a watershed moment that required a massive response. In D.C., the rioting came within 2 blocks of the White House. They had more National Guardsmen. It was the largest, the Army and National Guard put together, something like 120,000 troops, 70,000 deployed, 50,000 on standby. The largest domestic deployment of troops, the use of troops on American soil since the Civil War. And there's a lot that I want to say in these pages about what King had to say about riots and about where things needed to go. But I'll leave it at that. That last year and the Poor People's Campaign, I'll speak about it in the wrap-up. The Poor People's Campaign and the Memphis Campaign, I think you can see had enormous significance, not just as, King helping out the poor, but as a strategy for trying to escalate the struggle and take it to a higher level. And we have a lot to learn from that history. Thank you. Oh, man. Do we have to be T.O. Jones? I want to be James Brown. I mean, if we're picking who we're going to be, Yeah, a sister here was talking. I was like, how to summarize? I was like, making notes about what everybody said. I just wrote, racism doesn't make any sense. But then I was thinking, okay, and I felt like you were kind of saying, well, what is it? What is racism? Where does it come from? But there is a sense to it, not from our perspective, but from their perspective. If people haven't read Where Do We Go From Here, not just a speech, there is a speech, Where Do We Go From Here? But the book, Where Do We Go From Here? King weighs in on all kinds of stuff that you don't think of King as being a guy to weigh in on. Like, slavery, and the origins of racism. It seems to be a fact of life that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some rationalization to clothe their acts in the garments of righteousness. And so, with the growth of slavery, men had to convince themselves that a system which was so economically profitable was morally justifiable. The attempt to give moral sanction to a profitable system gave birth to the doctrine of white supremacy.
All right.
Martin Luther King. Now, I feel like Paul just threw that gauntlet down. He is a socialist. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, Paul. Truth is found neither in traditional capitalism nor in classical communism. Each represents a partial truth. Capitalism fails to see the truth in collectivism. Communism fails to see the truth in individualism. Capitalism fails to realize that life is social. Communism fails to realize that life is personal. And on and on and on. And then he says the truth is really about, it's about reconciling the two and charting some path in between. And it's not hard to understand why I think he wasn't a socialist. And I think, it's like too broad a definition then if you say he's a socialist. I think he was a radical reformer. He was a radical reformer. He wanted radical reform. And the people that came after him wanted actual revolution. Part of the reason that I think he didn't go to the idea of actual revolution is because let's debate, let's have a beer, I can't wait, and discuss it more, but I think he thought revolution was not possible. And King is known for all these moral reasons and moral ideas, and like he was a dreamer who philosophized on the clouds. But there's a lot of stuff in King that's about practical, real, strategic considerations, like the thing about violence. Actually, the book, the purpose of the book is a polemic against black power. But he spends, and I think we can learn from this, he spends a good chunk of the beginning of the book defending black power, defending the riots, explaining why people are feeling that slogan. In fact, he even defends the people who are booing him. And he thinks about it, he tries to understand why people would boo him. He says, he's laying awake at night thinking about it. He says, why would they boo one so close to them? But as I lay awake thinking, I finally came to myself, and I could not, for the life of me, have less than patience and understanding for those young people. For 12 years, I and others like me held out radiant promises of progress. I had preached to them about my dream. I had lectured to them about the not too distant day when they would have freedom. I urged them to have faith in America and in white society. Their hopes soared. They were now booing because they felt we were unable to deliver on our promises. And I think that's it. They were booing because we had urged to have faith and people had proved too often unfaithful. They were now hostile because they were watching the dream that they had so readily accepted turn into a frustrating nightmare. That's what explains why people were rioting in the cities of America from 1965 onward. All of the promises of voting rights and civil rights, people thought, oh, this is going to turn things around from us, and it's going to be a whole lot better. And when it wasn't, it seemed like King was discredited in people's eyes. His idea of hoping in the system, believing in the system, seemed discredited, and King understood that. But he argued against a violent response, in part because he thought it couldn't win. But listen to this. Is this a moral reason to be against a kind of violent revolution? And I'm not saying this is what we're for yet. I'm not talking about what a socialist response is, but I'm just saying, listen to King and tell me if you hear an iota of moralism in this argument. He says there are incalculable perils in this approach. It's not the danger of sacrifice of physical being, which is primary, though it cannot be contemplated without a deep sense of concern for human life. The greatest danger is that it will fail to attract Negroes to a real collective struggle and will confuse the large uncommitted middle group, which as yet has not supported either side. What? Will fail? I mean, that's a strategy. That's a question of strategy. To pick up arms or not to pick up arms, whether or not it'll build a bigger movement. And if you do it at a point where it cuts you off and isolates you, which, I mean, in those words are prophetic in a way, from what happened in some of the black radicals who went in that direction and actually cut them off from the uncommitted middle group, who didn't see that as a mass strategy. there's so many things I want to say. I have to go quickly. Oh, what was the other thing I wanted to say? About violence and about whether or not it can win. Listen, here's what he said about guerrilla warfare. I mean, this is King. And about whether or not a violent... And again, this is what I'm saying. I'm not saying this is our politics. This is, I think, why King is a radical reformer, because I think he thought revolution couldn't work. Because the way he imagined it, as like a racial, violent revolution kind of thing. Like with guns, like black people or people of color bum rushing the government a la Cuba or something like that, literally. And that's what people were advocating. Some people were, that was their vision. And King says, look, that can't work. This is King. No internal revolution has ever succeeded in overthrowing a government by violence unless the government had already lost the allegiance and effective control of its armed forces. Anyone in his right mind knows that this will not happen in the United States. Well, but I'm saying, but from his perspective, he doesn't see it playing out. Not for moral reasons, but strategically. Can that actually happen? Here's what he says. In a violent racial situation, which I think he's right about, the power structure has the local police, the state troopers, the National Guard, and finally the army to call on, all of which are predominantly white. What was not in the cards at this moment in history was a mass multiracial working class revolutionary that presents itself to the army as a real alternative to military authority. All of that, like a la Russia, was not yet in the offing. The white working class, for a bunch of reasons that King himself spoke out about what was happening to the unions, what was happening to the AFL-CIO, for all of those reasons, the kind of white working class thing was not catching up to the radicalization in the black working class. And I think that's why, the book that really goes through it is this book, Jack Bloom's, Class, Race, and the Civil Rights Movement, basically says, and that's the rock that the civil rights thing foundered on. The black movement could only go so far because ultimately the 1/10 of the population. And if you want to try to push it further, it required a greater force. And that force was not available. And so the logic of black power is, how do we go forward anyway? Even though the mass of American society isn't ready to come with us, how do we go forward anyway? And so King, I think, here is arguing for a kind of vision of radical reform because he doesn't see revolution as a real possibility. There's a number of other things, that he talks about. Black nationalism. He weighs in on the whole question of third world revolution and its relationship to a whole series of things that people really need to read King saying and learn from. Jesse Helms thought he was a socialist. Jesse Helms called King an action-oriented Marxist, which I'm sure he intended as an insult, and I would take it as a compliment. Oh, action-oriented. Thank you. I think of myself as an action-oriented Marxist. But I think J. Edgar Hoover was right. I think in 1968, Martin Luther King was the most dangerous Negro in America. Thank you.